Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a less discussed but deeply revealing chapter of World War I, Africa's role in the imperial game of chess that set the stage for conflict, exploitation, and resistance. Now, before the first shot of the Great War was ever fired, Africa had already been carved up like a colonial buffet. And the carving? Well, it was fast, brutal, and shockingly bureaucratic. Let's rewind to the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. Picture this: European diplomats, gathered in elegant halls, drawing lines across a map of Africa like they were sketching out real estate plans. Not a single African leader was invited. Not one. Nations were divided, unified, and erased on paper, without the slightest consideration for the complex tapestry of cultures, languages, and tribes that actually lived there. It was empire by pen stroke. By 1914, nearly the entire continent had been swallowed by European colonial powers. The only significant exceptions? Liberia and Ethiopia, both managing, miraculously, to avoid the full weight of colonial rule. Germany, still relatively new to the imperial game, had claimed several strategic outposts like Tanganyika, modern-day Tanzania, and Cameroon. These territories were more than just trophies. They were cogs in a larger machine. Why did the European empires care so much about African land? Simple: resources and power. Colonies served as raw material pipelines: rubber, cotton, minerals, you name it. But just as importantly, they were strategic chess pieces in the global imperial competition. Control over coastal ports, trade routes, and key geographic choke points gave empires leverage, military, economic, and psychological. But this isn't just a story about maps and minerals. It's a story about how global empires laid the foundation for a conflict that would drag African lives into a war they didn't start, and one they were never meant to win from. And that's where our journey really begins. Let's move on. When World War I broke out in 1914, the battlefield didn't stay confined to Europe's muddy trenches. Oh no, Africa, too, became a pawn in the imperial game. The colonies, especially those held by Germany, were immediately dragged into the chaos. Why? Because in a war of empires, every colony was a strategic asset or a vulnerability. German colonies like Togoland, German Southwest Africa, and German East Africa were some of the first targets. The Allies understood something critical: controlling the colonies wasn't just about pride or prestige, it was about logistics, communication lines, naval control, and economic disruption. These were more than territories, they were lifelines. So, Allied powers struck quickly. British, French, Belgian, and even South African forces coordinated attacks on German holdings across the continent. In some cases, the Germans were overwhelmed in a matter of days. In others, they dug in and turned the African landscape into a long and costly front. But here's where things got complicated. Africa's terrain isn't uniform, it's a wild mix of jungles, deserts, savannas, mountains, and swamps. This wasn't trench warfare. This was guerrilla fighting, disease-infested marches, and supply chains stretched to the breaking point. Think about it. How do you launch a military campaign in a dense rainforest when your maps are outdated, your soldiers are underprepared, and the climate is trying to kill you? Africa's environment reshaped the war itself. Campaigns dragged on longer than expected. Military planning became a nightmare. The local geography favored decentralized resistance over clean victories. And slowly, the reality set in. This wasn't going to be a quick conquest. Africa was a chessboard, yes, but the rules of the game were nothing like Europe expected. The question is, who paid the price for these imperial ambitions on African soil? Well, that's what we're about to uncover. Now here's where the story turns from imperial ambition to human tragedy. Once the war came to Africa, the colonial powers didn't just fight with their own soldiers. No, they turned to the people they ruled, Africans themselves. Hundreds of thousands were conscripted, often with no choice in the matter. Some were drafted as soldiers. Many more were forced to serve as porters, hauling supplies through brutal terrain, without proper food, clothing, or rest. Imagine carrying hundreds of pounds of equipment through heat, jungle, and disease-ridden zones, all while a war raged around you, and you barely understood why you were even there. For many Africans, the war wasn't fought with rifles, but with blistered feet, broken backs, and calloused hands. The casualties? Devastating, not just from bullets, but from disease, exhaustion, malnutrition, and exposure. Porters, those nameless, faceless laborers behind the front lines, died in staggering numbers. Often, they weren't even counted in official tallies. To the empires, they They were tools, replaceable, disposable. But the impact didn't stop there. The economic and social fallout of this forced mobilization rippled across communities. When able-bodied men were taken to serve, farms went untended, villages were left vulnerable, resources were seized for the war effort, and in many places, famine followed. This wasn't just collateral damage. It was the direct result of colonial war policy, of an imperial system that viewed African people not as citizens, but as labor units. So, while Europe burned in trench warfare, Africa bled quietly under the weight of imperial logistics. And still, the full cost was only beginning to unfold. Now let's zoom out and talk systems, because behind every battlefield decision was a bureaucratic machine. And in colonial Africa during the war, that machine was running on centralized command, coercion, and deeply flawed incentives. Colonial economies were never built to benefit Africans. They were designed to serve European interests. But during the war, that dynamic intensified. What we see is the classic case of a command economy gone wrong. Decisions were made top-down, with little understanding of local needs and no room for feedback. The priority? Feed the war machine. Everything else, human welfare, sustainability, long-term development, was secondary at best. This meant entire African regions were restructured around military goals. Crops were commandeered. Transportation was redirected. Communities were forcibly reorganized. In many cases, the colonial authorities simply took what they needed and left local populations to deal with the consequences. And then there's taxation and forced labor. These weren't minor inconveniences. Arbitrary taxes were levied on populations that had no voice in government, and when people couldn't pay, the punishment was forced labor. Imagine being pulled from your home, your farm, your family, not for breaking a law, but for failing to fund the empire that colonized you. Naturally, this sparked resistance. But here's the real kicker: the incentive structures in place didn't reward efficiency, creativity, or local knowledge. They rewarded obedience, compliance, and fear. This meant systems grew increasingly inefficient and corrupt. Bureaucrats wanted to keep their quotas up, not improve outcomes. Soldiers wanted to avoid blame, not ensure justice. So instead of building anything lasting, the colonial war economy sowed chaos, devouring resources, alienating populations, and laying the groundwork for long-term instability, all in the name of empire. But even amid that chaos, there were pockets of resistance, and one in particular would challenge the entire logic of colonial warfare. All right, buckle in, because this is the part of the story where the underdog doesn't just survive, he outmaneuvers the entire imperial system. Welcome to German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, where one man, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, turned colonial warfare on its head. While the rest of the world waged total war with massive armies and industrial firepower, Lettow-Vorbeck took a different approach: guerrilla warfare. With just a few thousand troops, many of them African askari soldiers, he tied down over 100,000 Allied forces for nearly the entire duration of the war. Think about that. One region, one commander, and a strategy built on mobility, unpredictability, and deep understanding of the terrain. He didn't fight fair. He fought smart. Instead of defending territory, he kept moving, using East Africa's harsh geography as a shield. Mountains, jungles, rivers, these weren't obstacles. They were weapons. His troops carried minimal supplies, relying on captured resources and knowledge of the land. They never stayed in one place long enough to be cornered. But this wasn't a romantic resistance story. The cost of his strategy was borne by local populations. As he moved, his forces commandeered food, animals, and labor. Villages were caught in the crossfire. And remember, this was all to serve a European empire's interests. Still, from a military standpoint, he exposed a fundamental flaw in the Allied approach. They were fighting with rigid strategies in a place that demanded flexibility. Lettow-Vorbeck's campaign became a symbol of asymmetrical resistance, a case study in how small, adaptive forces can challenge massive centralized power. He was never defeated in battle. He only surrendered after hearing Germany had signed the armistice. His legacy? Complicated. But strategically, he forced the Allied powers to dump enormous resources into a sideshow theater of war, proving that empire doesn't always equal efficiency, and that top-down control can crumble when it meets unpredictable resistance on unfamiliar ground. And that brings us to the aftermath. What happens when the smoke clears, but the maps are redrawn yet again, without asking the people who live there? When the war finally ended in 1918, Europe took a deep breath and reached for a new set of map pencils. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just punish Germany, it redistributed its colonial possessions like poker chips at a high-stakes table. German East Africa, handed over to Britain. Togoland and Cameroon, split between France and Britain. German Southwest Africa, given to South Africa. But here's the part that's rarely emphasized. This wasn't decolonization. It was recolonization. They didn't ask Africans what they wanted. They didn't consider ethnic groups, language families, or existing alliances. No, the decisions were made in distant rooms, under the authority of something called the League of Nations Mandate System. Sound progressive? Think again. The mandate system was marketed as a kind of international trusteeship, an enlightened way to guide a less developed societies toward self-rule. But in practice, it was colonialism with better PR. The territories were just reassigned, not liberated. Africans still had no sovereignty, no vote, no say, and the damage was deeper than just a flag change. In redrawing borders, colonial administrators often split ethnic groups across artificial lines, or mashed rival communities together under one administration. This wasn't just careless, it was destabilizing. It laid the groundwork for decades of tension, conflict, and civil unrest long after the colonial flags came down. So, what did Africa get from its forced role in the First World War? Not freedom, not reparations, just a new layer of foreign rule, painted over the old one. And yet, despite being overlooked in most history books, this reshuffling of empires had massive long-term consequences. Because if you want to understand the instability that followed in many African nations during the 20th century, you can start right here, with post-war borders drawn by people who never set foot on the soil they were slicing up. But the moral reckoning doesn't end with lines on a map. Let's step back and ask, what did this war actually cost Africa, and who truly gained from the chaos? So, let's ask the question nobody seems to want to answer. What was the point of all this, for Africa? Did African people gain independence after shedding blood for empires that barely recognized their humanity? Did they gain political voice, land reform, or even basic rights? The short answer? No. World War I dragged Africa into a European conflict without consent, without benefit, and without apology. Africans were conscripted, taxed, uprooted, and killed, often fighting wars they didn't start and defending governments they didn't elect. And when the war was over, instead of gratitude or autonomy, they got more bureaucracy, more foreign flags, more exploitation. The African contribution to the war, both on the battlefield and behind the lines, is one of the most ignored chapters in global history. Why? Because it complicates the neat little narrative that casts World War I as a purely European tragedy. It wasn't. It was global. And Africa, though often silent in the records, was a stage of immense suffering, manipulation, and resistance. But here's the deeper wound. This war reinforced an imperial idea, that African lives could be instrumentalized, used as tools in global games of power, that the systems exploiting them were too big, too distant, and too orderly to question, and that, somehow, this was normal. And that idea, that some nations exist to serve others, that damage doesn't disappear when the war ends. It lingers, it calcifies, it becomes the groundwork for future conflicts, future revolutions, and future betrayals. So what, exactly, was gained? A few new colonial masters, a few new borders, and a generation of African men and women forever changed by a war they never chose to fight. But it's not just about what happened. It's about what could have happened if Africa had been left to shape its own future. That's where we end. Let's bring it home in the last slide. Let's end with a pause, not a period, but a pause, because this history still echoes. Africa's involvement in World War I wasn't accidental. It wasn't marginal. It was structural. It was built into the very framework of empire, where centralized systems of control extended their reach thousands of miles across oceans, commanding lives, extracting labor, and redrawing entire civilizations by decree. And here's the uncomfortable truth: none of this was inevitable. These were choices, made by people, made by systems, that placed power over principle, and control over consent. What if Africa had never been carved up at the Berlin Conference? What if its people had been allowed to build systems rooted in their own traditions, their own economics, their own sense of justice? What if the war had not been an excuse to deepen imperial roots, but a turning point toward autonomy? Instead, the war reinforced the architecture of dependence. It taught African leaders that change would not come through contribution, but through confrontation. It delayed dreams of self-determination, hardened the structures of inequality, and passed down a legacy of fractured borders, imposed hierarchies, and systemic vulnerability. But the memory remains. And it matters, because when we remember this forgotten front of World War I, we begin to see the war not just as a clash of armies, but as a clash of worldviews, between imposed order and organic freedom, between distant rule and local agency. And that's the truth behind history. If you found this story powerful, enlightening, or even just thought-provoking, then make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out the podcast version of this episode in the link below if you want to listen on the go. And if you want more history that doesn't just tell you what happened, but why it mattered, stick around. We've got plenty more stories to uncover. Thanks for watching.